Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we bridge academics and practical marketing. Each week, we sit down and go deep behind some of America's most successful brands. I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
And today we're sitting with Phil Graves, author of the acclaimed book Consumerology and founder of Shift Consultancy, a firm specializing in integrating behavioral science with qualitative research. Let's get into it. So Phil, welcome to Behavioral Science for Brands. Richard and I, as we were talking about before the show, are on this little mission to find the best applications of behavioral science, bring them to the world of marketing. And we're so excited for our conversation today. Our listeners love when we get to bring in folks that are in the field that can just jam and talk with us. But before we get started, if it's okay with you, you'll indulge me as I give our listeners a little bit of background on you. You are a renowned expert in consumer behavior and psychology. Your book, Consumerology, The Truth About Consumers and the Psychology of Shopping, challenges traditional market research methods by highlighting their limitations in accurately predicting consumer behavior. In 2005, you started Shift Consultancy, which focuses on aligning market research with insights from behavioral economics and psychology. And from all that I've read, your work spans many sectors: financial services, health, FMCG, retail, media, technology. And for those that may not be familiar with your work, you've been at this forefront of bringing these two very important disciplines together, and we're very excited to have you be with us today. So our listeners love stories. Maybe you could start at the beginning and tell us, how did you get introduced to the world of research, of consumer psychology, of behavioral thinking? Where did this all begin for you?
So by education, I was a statistician, and after a couple of career false starts, that sent me into the world of market research from the kind of quantitative end of things. And as it happens, in the interview for the first the first market research job that I got, I was asked if I had experience with qualitative market research by the head of research within this large financial services company. And I said I did, and I genuinely meant it, but I subsequently came to realize that I didn't actually know what qualitative research was. Which didn't prove to be a major hurdle and didn't stop me getting the job. I was sufficiently convincing in all innocence. And then once I got into it, it was fine. So then once I started working in the field of market research, I very quickly became curious about why it was so often wrong. And that was my platform, purely from a pragmatic, look, my job apparently is to understand consumers. So what we're doing doesn't seem to work. Either it's clearly wrong when we launch whatever we launch, or people who've got lots of years of operational experience are kind of, incredulous about the results that are coming out of the focus groups, or whatever it might be. So I then started to say, okay, well, I need to look into this. How do you do that? And, and this was some considerable time ago because unfortunately I'm old. There wasn't a lot of consumer psychology around academically, if any. And what I looked at, first of all, was psychoanalysis. So I was trying to reconcile, how is it if you were going to go and see a therapist, that you go in and say, I'm really stressed. And they say, well, why do you think you're stressed? And you say, I think I've been doing a lot. And they say, well, do less. And you go out and you've handed over your £200 and you go, well, that didn't seem particularly insightful. And of course, that's not the process of psychoanalysis. The process of psychoanalysis is that you don't really understand why you interact with the world in the way that you do, and that you've formed these structures in your mind and these ways of going about life that ultimately are proving counterproductive. And through a process of psychoanalysis, a therapist can get you to a point of realizing how it is you see the world and how that maybe isn't the only way to see it, at a risk of crassly simplifying psychoanalysis. So that then took me so far. And then as I started to look more and more into it, I started to come across the world of behavioral science, behavioral economics. And the recurring theme there is we do stuff in experiments, we make people behave differently, but afterwards they never ascribe their behavior to what we've changed. And they go, oh, you pumped that music in while I was making my shopping, or, that smell was in the air, wasn't it? That's never what happens. What happens is the post-rationalization. Well, of course, I did sensible things for sensible reasons. And it just opened my eyes up to what I'd seen going on in all the research that I'd done. And as I went further and further into that and started exploring more and more, and I'd emphasize this was all from a practical perspective. This wasn't an academic exercise. What I started to discover was that all of the cognitive biases, or many of the cognitive biases that are identified through academic work in the field of behavioral economics, are kind of just built into most market research. They're a fundamental part of it. And aside from the fact that the fundamental premise of market research is, when it's interrogative in nature, that the people you're speaking to understand themselves and why they do things. And everything we see from behavioral psychology says that ain't the case. Very clearly, it's not the case. And you've got books like Strangers to Ourselves by Timothy Wilson, about the illusion of conscious will by Daniel Wegner. Lots of work that's gone on, and things that go back to the early part of the early 1900s, where people were debating that, people don't actually understand what they're doing. And where there was, of course, a Nobel Prize famously awarded for Daniel Kahneman and Tversky's work. And yet, we come back to this platform within the world of market research. It's all right, we'll ask people, and then we'll believe what they tell us, which we kind of don't do in any other facet of life. Particularly if you're British and somewhat cynical in nature. If people tell me stuff, you don't go, well, that's definitely true. I'll gobble it up. Well, is there anything to support that? And so, that was my journey. And I had no intention of starting my own consultancy business, of starting my own research company. But I kind of ended up, doing it by default almost, because I just felt that most insight work was being done so poorly.
Thank you for sharing that.
Very long answer to a short.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. No, thank you for sharing that. And, Richard and I, as we were preparing for today's talk, we found this great quote that you go even further and you say, focus groups, surveys, standard market research is a perfect recipe for getting flawed data. I mean, and I think what you were describing is the reason why. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you can approach it from either angle. You can approach it empirically and say, have we got evidence that this works all the time? No, clearly not. And anybody out there who's using market research will realize, if they look back objectively, there have been lots of times when it didn't prove to be right. You can look at the fact that something like 75% of new products that are launched, most of which are consumer tested, fail within a year. So we're not short of empirical evidence that this process has some question marks against it. Or you approach it from the other angle and say, okay, where's the evidence that people understand their own decision making? And I went looking for that, and that was kind of the journey that was Consumerology, and there isn't any. And there's a huge amount of evidence that they don't. And so from that point of view, if you then get into more specific issues with different types of research. So, there is a special place reserved for focus groups, which were born out of psychotherapy, where groups of people were put together because they change behavior. And yet we do focus groups and think, we're getting deeper insights as a result of these social dynamics. There's no evidence for that. And in fact, at a viewing facility, people being watched change the way they become more self-conscious, change the way they speak, change what they think about. The desire, you're talking about normally something pretty banal to the average person. This is not about matters of life and death. It's, do you like this biscuit? At which point, somebody offers a point of view, it seems reasonable, I'll go along with that, cognitively easy. I don't want to fall out with you because we're here chatting about biscuits. You add in the moderator who's using behaviors that are designed to elicit response, because the worst thing for a moderator is people not talking. But those please you behaviors, as they're known within psychoanalysis, elicit certain kind of favorable reactions from people. So there is all this kind of psychology going on the surface, which means that what comes out of this is likely to be polarized artificially by virtue of being put into this group of strangers, and very little to do with really what those people will do. And you've stripped away all the context that's important when people are actually making consumer decisions and replaced it with this other context, which has got so little to do with how most buying decisions take place. But then you get other problems if you're looking at surveys to do with how you're priming people, how you're framing questions, where you're giving them pre-coded responses. All of those things have a fairly predictable effect on what people will say and how they will respond. And again, there's lots of evidence from where different sequencing of questions been asked, where you add in or don't you have an opinion to opinion poll type questions. And you find out if you add in the or don't you have an opinion, you completely change the result. And when I looked at one particular study that was done by big research companies independently at the same time, they got answers which were 60 percentage points apart to the same fundamental question. And it was explicable when you looked at the trail of kind of bias and influence that took place through the questionnaires. And it's just unavoidable.
So I think our listeners will be very interested to go a little deeper into some of the different research methodologies and some of the known issues with them. But before we do that, why do you think this persists? Why after all of this evidence, do you think that the industry continues to return to these methods that have obvious, at least limitations, if not downright fallacies built into them?
Well, that's a delicious question for a psychologist. So a lot of people believe all sorts of stuff that patently isn't true. And you can pick your poison. You can pick all the religions you don't believe in if you happen to believe in a religion. You can pick mediums and psychics. You can pick horoscopes. You can pick medicine that doesn't really do anything. Anything you like. And there's all sorts of reasons that people believe in these things. There are placebo effects, and there are placebo effects in research. We're thinking about doing something scary, or we've asked 1,000 people and they said, go for it. So we're going for it. We feel much better now. Well, good, but you shouldn't. It's generally very easy to do market research. You send out your questionnaires, you get an agency in. There's no operational messiness. You don't have to worry about legal getting involved or, align your operational team with doing anything. You just do whatever you want, ask whatever you like, go ahead and do it. You get your results back very quickly. It's not that expensive to do. And if you look across all human behavior, you'll see a trade-off between effort and reward, where I'll take a little bit of reward if it's easy to do over something that's quite difficult to do, but would be much more rewarding ultimately. You've got the status quo element of if you're not being fired for producing rubbish insight at the moment, why on earth would you take on the risk and loss aversion of doing something different? No one's asking you to come in and shake things up and challenge things. And you get the confirmation bias, which is you kind of select the bits of research that you remember as being really useful, which is all the good bits and all the times things seem to pan out in line with what you researched, and forget about all the times it didn't. And of course, that's something humans are brilliant at doing, and you don't have to have a really high hit rate to keep the confirmation bias going. Because we're so good at dismissing things that cause us cognitive dissonance that don't fit in with our worldview. And there's sort of social proof out there that everybody else is doing it, aren't they? So, you look at it from that point of view. And coming back to that point around kind of what do you get rewarded for in large organizations? You get rewarded for coming in and shaking things up and challenging what's going on day to day. In large organizations, that kind of gets you fired. And I speak from some personal experience. In small dynamic startups, absolutely, you're learning as you go, you're shaking things up, you're being dynamic. But large companies, they don't like the pool being rippled, and people who prosper there kind of know that. So it's challenging to bring about that change, and there's a whole heap of reasons why change doesn't happen.
I mean, that's a very potent mix that's keeping that kind of standard market research approach going. If you were trying to persuade an organization to do things differently, now, do you think there are tactics to break through those biases and barriers? How do you think it is? How do you think the best way to kind of sell in an alternative is?
An excellent question. The way that you do it, and I should say, having said all those things I've just shared with you, I do have a house, and I'm able to feed my dogs and children and things. That I have earned a livelihood. The interesting thing is you can't explain that to people. All the things I said to you, both about why current market research essentially doesn't work. I mean, it'll be right one time in three, but that's because it can either be right, wrong, or not sure. Those are your only three outcomes. So, a third of the time you've got the evidence to support what you're doing. So you can't say to people, look, let me explain to you why people don't understand themselves, why asking them questions is really a terrible idea, and why everything you've been doing up until now was essentially a waste of money. Because the response that anyone will have to that is, well, either I could believe that, and it invalidates everything I've been doing, and that hasn't resulted in me being fired or, beaten or whipped by my superiors. Or I could believe you and then just be thrown into this world of turmoil. So psychologically, that's such a weighted equation that it's never going to work, and I know because I've tried it. So instead, what you have to do is say, look, there are insights you're not currently getting. A large part of human decision-making is unconscious. And then, the work that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky and others have done in highlighting that is quite a useful platform to use, because people, you've heard about thinking fast and slow, and it sounds quite important. We don't really know what to do with it. Well, there's this thing called the unconscious mind. And actually, I can do some tricks with people in the room to demonstrate how priming works and so on. And that you're all susceptible to all of this. And again, I've done that in the past too. So if you want to get deeper insights, you need to use techniques that recognize that aspect of how people think, and can help you identify it and then make better decisions. And you have to leave them to do the 2 + 2 means, well, hang on a second, what about all the stuff we've done before? But fortunately, they never do that math because it's too uncomfortable. And again, the nature of being in a large organization is that you don't get rewarded for looking back. So you have to focus on here's a little bit extra, and here's how it works.
I really like that as an approach. I'm particularly intrigued by the tricks and experiments that you used to persuade people in the room, because I think there's nothing better than a live demonstration. Is there a particular go-to experiment you think worked in a small group that you return to again and again?
I've used. I came up with a kind of a questionnaire, which had, I think, probably maybe 10 different questions on that highlight different aspects of how people's brains really work. And then all you do is have 2 questionnaires. People don't know you have 2 questionnaires. And then you compare the answers that you get from people, and you can demonstrate things like, heuristics, framing effect, priming, how social proof works in practice, and those kinds of things. So yeah, I mean, it's all stuff it's standing on the shoulders of the giants of the field, and then just sort of shaping it in a way that's kind of fun and engaging for people, and duping them in the process. And at the end, you kind of get them, oh, right, okay, yeah, I suppose it is hard for me to argue with priming when you've just demonstrated that I'm very susceptible to it.
Yeah. So you've run the experiments with this fictitious client, and there's a glimmer of hope, and they're interested in an additional approach to market research. What does that look like? So if we can't give too much validity to focus groups and a standard survey approach, what would you do instead? What would your recommendations be?
The irony is it's really not too difficult. So if you say to people, look, imagine that asking people questions was illegal, arguably for marketing insight purposes, it should be. And it's also irritating if you're a consumer being asked questions. What would you do instead? And kind of anything now you come up with is likely to be better. Now, most of my work is done by, I've developed some techniques that recognize how people really think and make decisions and get as much of that present in the in the arena as it is I'm trying to find out whatever I'm trying to find out. And that comes down to, and I wrote about this in Consumerology, the effect criteria for psychological validity. So is what you're looking at an analysis of behavior? Because when you get people to behave, they're kind of doing things, they're revealing what it is they think. And so, behavioral data, really useful stuff, but also you can, put people in situations where you get them to behave. Is their frame of mind representative of how they would be and are thinking when they're doing the thing that you're interested in? Because if I want to find out how you buy orange juice, or whether you like a new orange juice that I'm bringing to the market, I don't need you thinking like some kind of scrutineer at a car show, looking at my product and going, oh, so this is a new thing, is it? Right, well, let me have a look at it and see what I think. Because that has nothing to do with the frame of mind you'll be in when you got a 2-year-old hanging off your ear, the dog's overheating in the car, you're just trying to get your shopping done as quickly as possible. Don't put dogs in cars, by the way. And get your shopping done. And you may very well have a deeply embedded habit of always buying the same brand, and will spend probably half or 1 second making that purchase. Well, if that's how you behave in that category, that's how I need you thinking when I explore our new fictitious orange juice. The environment is such a huge source of unconscious influences that if you strip that away, what are you left with, and what are you replacing it with? So I've developed questioning techniques that put people mentally into the environment where they're making a decision as a consumer for the thing that we're interested in. And then I make sure that the focus of what I'm interested in is covert, because I don't want people sensitized to the topic ahead of time. I don't want them knowing what I'm interested in. I don't want them focusing on the thing that matters, because they're not going to do that in real life. Out in real life, it's a bun fight with every other brand. And initially, at least, the time frame in which they are responding to something needs to come back to the example I gave, needs to reflect the time frame with which they're making a decision in the real life, in real world. Because without those things, you're in the wrong part of someone's brain getting the wrong information. And we're all capable of thinking and acting very differently to the same stimulus in a different context. If I said, what would you do if you really disagreed with someone? You might think, okay, well, imagine you're really disagreeing with someone. Really call that to mind now. And you can do it, but you're lying to yourself. And if you told me about it, you'd be lying to me. Because if you were at a football match or a soccer match and you disagreed with the referee, you'd probably be using some quite colourful language and screaming your head off. If you were in a board meeting and the person who pays your salary has just said something that you're really disagreeing with, you're probably going to find a way to talk around it in a different way. You may not even say anything at all. But we don't think about context unless context is put there for us. So the techniques I've developed use those principles, and it's not. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it's infallible. But it's putting as much there that we know is important in terms of how people respond to stuff, and taking out all the things we don't want. So I'm not going to ask people questions. So my new orange juice might be super healthy. Let's not get into the debate about sugar in orange juice, where it really is healthy. It's got vitamin C and it's not bad. So, I might be positioning my new orange juice as a super healthy orange juice. Okay. So I might want to ask you whether you think it's healthy, but I can't ask you that because you're not thinking about healthiness of orange juice when you walk into the shop, probably. I can't presume that you are, but as soon as I ask you that question, that thought is in your head and you will respond to it in your associative brain way because that's the way you design. And you will feel like that was the thought you always had, but it's only a consequence of me having asked the question. So I can't ask you any questions. So again, I have to use techniques that mean I can explore things without asking people questions and let them reveal to me how they react, how they think, how they behave. And then I can go leverage psychological consistency, which we all have desire for, and play around in their minds to find out all the whys.
So can you talk a little bit about, this is different than ethnographies alone, just following people when they shop, going into their homes and watching as they make decisions. It's closer on a spectrum of focus groups being at one end and what you're talking about being at the other. Ethnographies feels closer to me, but not the same thing. And can you maybe talk a little bit about the differences there?
Sure. Well, the biggest challenge to ethnography is, imagine anything you do in your life and then stick a stranger by your side. No longer the same thing. It doesn't matter what it is. It's changed. And it's changed massively because we're social creatures. Most of the time when we're sitting in our car, picking our nose, we imagine that the world doesn't know we're there. And it's only when we get caught on camera, invading our own nasal cavities that we kind of realize, oh, right, yeah, people can see me in the car. So, that's a big change. And we see in various experiments, you tell people that a chair is haunted, they act differently. They'll behave differently in experiments. So, putting someone into the mix makes people self-conscious and self-aware. And that in itself is a fascinating term because, saying to someone, I'm going to make you feel self-conscious. It's like, that's a really uncomfortable thing. But implicitly, that's what ethnography does. And there's no getting away from it. Now, I'm not entirely debunking ethnography. I mean, this got its place and you may learn something interesting from it. And I'm sure there'll be lots of times people feel they have. However, from a fundamental psychological point of view, you're already messing with the waters. So you've got to be aware that may have a bearing. And depending on what it is you're looking at, you've got all sorts of problems that come into it. I mean, a lot of research works on this premise that you've got to tell people exactly why you're doing it. So, at the point at which you say, look, and with ethnography, this is hard to avoid. Look, I want to come and watch you feeding your children to see, how you cope with meal times. Well, I'm now thinking ahead of time, right? Okay, what am I going to give them so I don't look like a terrible parent? And make sure they haven't eaten before, so they're hungry at the time. And all these things are just natural responses because we care about how we're perceived by other people. So it's a can of worms, and there are better ways, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I found one of those fascinating bits of consumerology was, as you've just expressed, that these elements like being watched, a questioner being involved, context, timing, they are so important that maybe the way to get around a lot of those issues is to run live testing. And I thought that was one of the most powerful arguments in the book. Could you explain what you mean by a live test? And maybe we can continue that OJ analogy if it helps. Like if I've got my OJ brand, orange juice brand, and I'm deciding I'm going to run a new creative, how could I run a live test to see whether this new intervention works?
Sure. So let me caveat this by saying undoubtedly live tests are the gold standard, but they're almost always impossible to do. But we'll come back to that. So from a theoretical point of view, live trials are brilliant because what you're doing is you're putting something out into the real world. Coming back to the effect criteria, let's say you've got a new pack for your orange juice. You get some made up, you stick them on the shelf in the supermarket, and you stand well back and see what happens. Okay, well, people are coming in thinking like they normally would think. You get to analyze their behavior. You watch and see whether they notice it. You see whether they pick it up. You see whether they want to buy it. They're in whatever frame of mind they should be in. They don't know you're doing the test as long as you're standing far enough away. You've got all the environmental cues represented, and they're spending however much time they normally spend buying orange juice, and you've had nothing to do with contaminating that. So it's brilliant. You add into that, well, it's like, well, let's test one pack in this store and we'll test another pack in another store, which you match, and normally they sell the same sort of mix of products and the same amount of our current product. And then another one here, and we've got our control condition, and we'll run these all at the same time because we know that the biggest thing that affects sales of drinks is whether it's hot or not. And so we'll see which one of these does best. And I have run trials like this and helped companies run trials like this, but it's incredibly difficult because there are logistical problems, there are legal problems, there are product sign-off problems, there are supply chain problems. It just goes on and on and on. Even with one bank, even in an area you think, well, this will be easy to do. We'll try some different letters to try and bring down the amount of kind of customer service complaints that you get when you're doing this particular thing. Oh yeah, we can't even change the signature on the bottom of the letters because it's hard coded into the computer system. Our computer system is so old. And in fact, we're not even sure who that person was. We're fairly sure they're either dead or no longer work at the bank. So, those are the realities of trying to do live trials. But, in the digital space, should companies be should they be gearing up much more to use them? I believe they should. If I was an FMCG brand, I would want to get my own friendly chain of stores and pay them a decent amount of money so that I could put my test products into them and see what happened. With digital marketing, you can try different campaigns, try different creative and see what reaction it gets, albeit a lot of digital marketing is shouting into the void and probably need to do quite a lot of it to get any kind of metric at all, but that's a story for another day. These things are out there to be tried, and the value of getting genuine data, real data, valid data over and above spurious data, even if it appears to be statistically valid because you've asked lots of people, there's no comparison, but it's incredibly hard to do for most organizations. Technology, young technology companies, I think, are something like 27 times more efficient than traditional companies. Established technology companies are something like 9 times more efficient than traditional companies. And it's all down to their ability and capacity for doing something, seeing what happens, and then adjusting. And again, there are lots of stories, even going back to the early days of Google, where they asked people how many search results they wanted per page. They gave them what they wanted, and then they saw results dropped away because pages were taking longer to load. All these things that you ask people and then you do something, you find out it's completely different. Getting the real, if you can find a way to get real data, it is always the best option.
So that's a lovely challenge, especially for our smaller companies that are listening, people that have more control over their brands. Maybe they are direct to consumer, or they have their own direct sales channels, so they have more control. So as a statistician, my question is, how much data is enough to give you the insight to make a business decision versus how much should we really push to have statistically significant confidence given the practical limitations that you went through? That how do you make a decision, or how do you have confidence in the decision you want to make?
So there are a couple of points within that. So I think it's worth coming back to the small firms point. So please remind me about that. Um, the statistical confidence thing, I've got a degree in statistics. I get the math, but it's bogus in practical terms. Because, the fact that I'm saying to you that, I can tell you that 75% of people think this, plus or minus 4% to 95% confidence, I know what that means. But what's the 75%? Where's that number come from? Is that a number that comes from a question that you genuinely understand people can tell you honestly, and that hasn't been influenced either by how you've asked it, the way you've asked it, the fact you've asked it at all? Like going back to the example I gave you before, it's not often we get one study or two studies that are looking exactly the same thing. They were 60 percentage points apart. Now, that wasn't something the statistics could explain, because statistically, the confidence interval on one number would have been 2 to 10 at worst, probably 3 to 9, and on the other would have been 60 to 70. So, even if you'd gone to the 9, it just wasn't going to work. That mathematically, there was that difference. The difference was all in the psychology and whether or not people could answer it. So you mustn't take false confidence from confidence intervals. Are they really, again, a flippant example I use, if I told you the average height of a tree in my garden was 60 meters, and you're like, oh, that's really interesting. And the question is, how the hell did you measure the height of your trees? It's like, well, I asked my 3-year-old how big the trees were. Oh, I'm not sure about the 60 figure now. And that's kind of where we're at with most survey data. But coming back to small businesses, and I had this experience, I met with a small company yesterday. And what I advise those companies to do is to sit down, think about what behavioral data you've either got or you can start to harness and do it, working on the assumption that these will be useful things to know. So they might be, where are your clients arriving from? It might be, kind of what are their connections? It might be what's their net worth? How much income have they got? It might be what's the first product they buy. Whatever it is, be clear in your mind that you should have a very separate pot for behavioral data, because it is true. And eventually it may tell you a useful story, but you shouldn't confuse sometimes the ease of getting that with the value that it potentially has to your business. And you would do better to spend time developing the structures, whatever, to collect that data now and have it as you're moving forward. And you won't get it perfectly right, but put the time into that rather than going out and dropping £20,000, $30,000 with some marketed research agency who believe that they can look into the future and ask people questions and come back and tell you what you should be doing there, because they can't.
Very helpful. Very helpful. Richard, do you have a follow-up question?
No, I just love that phrase of this kind of false confidence, and that I think is super useful. Maybe we should spend more time hanging a question mark at the end of some of the findings. And there might be a danger simply from, it's not just that the data coming in is misleading. It's actively dangerous. And I think that's kind of, that's a really interesting thing for people to consider. Not like a slight improvement on not doing something. It could actually be a retrograde step. I think that really hit me.
Well, one of the things that the insight world loves to talk about is triangulating. It's like, well, do our research here, and when we'll do this, and then we'll look at these numbers, and then we'll triangulate, and then that will get us to the best place. It's like, do you understand what triangulation is? If you've got false data in there, it's taking you away from the right point. Now, you might be running over the cliff with more confidence, but you shouldn't be. You should always be asking, how much can I trust this particular data point? How much can I trust this particular thing? And yet we keep finding that people go, well, if I've got more insights, that's better, isn't it? Well, no, not necessarily. There's a big watch out there with thinking about how much you should be trusting a particular insight, not just thinking that, they're kind of like stamps and collecting lots of them is better. I don't collect stamps.
As we're coming to a close, this is very interesting. You've committed yourself to writing the book, to having Shift as a consultancy that works with companies to solve this problem. For folks that come to Shift or want to follow the teachings in the book, one clear recommendation you had is start collecting behavioral data and hold it in a separate area because we know it's true. Is there other things when you come to work, when you partner with Shift, or that when you want to try to implement what we're learning in the book, that you would tell people to go out and try to do, or that you'd recommend as next steps to take this conversation and help give folks clear, actionable things to do moving forward?
Sure. So one thing would be the effect criteria. Is it an analysis of behavior? Is the frame of mind accurate? Is the environment present? Is the focus of what you're looking at, was it covert? And what's the time frame in which people have reacted? If you're looking at any piece of insight, ask yourself those 5 questions. How many of them can you say yes to? And if you find you can't say yes to very many of them, it's a good framing example, which is now the frame isn't, I should trust this because it's the voice of the consumer. Now the frame is, I realize this is not necessarily psychologically bad. There might be an interesting nugget in there. But throughout my career, the market research industry has been kind of bemoaning the fact it's not taken more seriously and doesn't have a seat on the board and doesn't have more weight within organizations and feels like it should, without ever recognizing that it gets kind of exactly the respect it deserves for what it produces. And the fact that people do, in a sense, cherry pick from insight to support their initial hypotheses very often. But so the effect criteria do give you a more rigorous way of saying, yes, we should put store in this, or no, we shouldn't, that several people, senior leaders, can look at together and say, actually, we need to be careful because we're working to an established set of criteria. And by the same token, when you are looking to make decisions, getting the best quality of insight and the best validity of insight should be your primary concern. And doing that, yes, there are companies like mine that use special techniques and charging quite a lot of money to do it. But you can approach it in a similar way yourself, and with an experimental mindset, and do relatively inexpensive things. If you've just made we'll come back to my very poor orange juice example. Say you just made your new orange juice, just stick some in the fridge at the office, or in another office, a friend's office, go and stick some in the fridge. Do people keep going back to them, picking them up? That might tell you whether it's nice. Hand one to someone without necessarily making a focus of it and see what they say. If you've convinced yourself that this is the freshest tasting orange juice in the world, well, do they tell you that anyway?
And prompt it?
Or do you need to prime them? So, being more creative about insight can take you a long way. I mean, one of the things I'd advocate that anyone does in any size organization is, subject to what you're doing, just go and watch consumers surreptitiously. Go and see what they do. It won't tell you what's going on inside their head, but without the right technique, nor will they, but it will tell you how long do they spend at the fixture? How long do they spend? Do they look confused when the service agent is talking to? If you're one of those companies that has has customer service by phone, listen to a random sample of calls, and just as a human being, say, does this feel like it's a good, rewarding conversation for the customer who's called in? And if it doesn't, okay, what would change that? A lot of these things are there in front of us, and some of the traditional insight work just gets in the way and stops us seeing what's really going on.
I think that's a really interesting one of just going and watching potential customers, how they interact, listening to calls. Because as organizations get larger and more bureaucratic, market research becomes something that you go to other people to do for you. And I think that's a lovely idea of thinking, well, if you do that, you are missing out on many of these interactions that could be hugely valuable. Maybe it's something that more people should think of, how can I get these experiences, rather than asking someone to pre-package them for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the challenges that can produce is that, let's say we're a company and you, Richard, go off and you go, well, yeah, we were talking about launching this product and I've been watching people and they all just grab Tropicana in a heartbeat. And I think we might be wasting our time. It's like, well, no, that's just your view. That's just what you think. And you never wanted to do this anyway. And you get all of that. Whereas, it's like, well, I've just commissioned this focus group report and they're saying they've been. So, that's just you. And this is we spent £15,000 on this. So we'll believe that because you're just giving me your free, where in fact you're right. So one of the ways around that is to make that process a little bit more formal and say, look, we're working on this. It's important to the business. All three of us are going to go out independently and see what we can see in this category. And we'll come back, we'll write up a brief summary of what we've seen. And if we've all seen the same thing, that's probably quite a useful insight. Now, we've seen something different. We need to dig into it a little bit. For the moment, we've not spent a huge amount of money. We've got closer to our consumers, but we haven't asked consumers anything. At this point, you've got that's something you have to handle with great care. You can learn things. And one of the things I've said several times is I have no problem with talking to consumers. I only have a problem with believing things they tell us. So the problem tends to be if I say, Richard, you went to a shop and watched and used, and yes, I did. And I asked a couple of people and they said they thought this would be a really good idea. Now that feels like it has weight, and it shouldn't. I mean, one of the things in our report, you will never see a verbatim quote. Because fundamentally, we don't believe what people say. So why on earth would we quote them? What we're looking is how they think and what's going on in their mind. And very often that's about what they don't say, or about how they say something, or about how what they've said relates to what they've done. So, we don't need to report any of that to people. But people still love verbatim quotes because they feel like they're getting something from straight out the horse's mouth, so to speak. But again, we shouldn't. So structuring that sort of exercise, a really good way. No one's spending thousands of pounds, but often can be more valid than the alternative that you're wasting money on.
This is lovely. Really a super interesting and challenging conversation, Phil. There's lots of questions I want to continue to follow up with. The one that I'll end on is, could you share something you're excited about in the future of this field, whether it's how AI might impact what's happening with understanding behavioral data, or some other trend or insight that you're excited about? What's Phil Graves most excited about in the upcoming future in this work?
I think it would be a combination of AI and quantum computing. Not that I really understand either at any kind of useful technical level. I've seen the same adverts as everyone else. But I think one of the problems that we've got, people have been excited about collecting behavioral data for quite a long time. And what they quickly find is in most organizations, they get too much too quickly and they cannot deal with it. I think AI can help with that. And I think more computer processing power can help with that. And together, those two things will see us looking a lot more to the value of capturing and using data than anything else that I see up ahead. So I think that for me is an exciting future. If your goal is to ultimately understand and optimize what consumers are doing. I mean, frankly, I know there's much money in it for me, but that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm old enough not to worry about that too much anymore. But I think in terms of getting, caring about, this subject, caring about understanding consumers better, I think that's a really interesting area that has huge potential.
we'll all watch it together with a lot of excitement. That's really great. Thank you again, Phil, for joining us today. For those listening, if this conversation was interesting, please leave us a comment, interact with us on this topic, or share this podcast with someone else who loves marketing and behavioral science as much as we all do. And until next time, I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
Happy listening.
Behavioral Science for Brands is brought to you by Method One. Recognized as one of the fastest growing companies in America for the third year in a row, featured on Inc.'s 5,000 list. Method One is a proudly independent creative and media agency grounded in behavioral science. They exist to make brands irresistible, helping people discover products, services, and experiences that bring moments of joy to their lives. As behavior change experts, Method One creates emotional connections that drive true brand value for their clients, focusing primarily with indulgence brands in the CPG space. Find out more at methodone.com.